So I'm so excited for this conversation because, first of all, I have to give one other gratitude, which is to Susan Goland, who lives in Los Angeles and then is an alum of our Kivun program. And Susan was the one who, about 6 months ago, I think, emailed me and said, "Have you seen this book?" And here's the book on mindful democracy. And I was like, "Oh my goodness, I have to have this book." And so I bought the book. And immediately it was one of those, I'm so glad that Susan thought of that because this was right up my alley and like went right to my heart. And so then I did what am prone to do. And I was like, let's just get in touch with Jeremy Engels and I'll just look him up. And sure enough, he was relatively easy to find, thankfully. So I emailed Jeremy and we've had a lovely conversation and immediately thought we should have a conversation with more people. So here we are. So, Jeremy, I'm so glad that you are here tonight and that we get to talk about this a week before-ish, a week and a half before the 250th anniversary of American Independence Day.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to just begin by inviting you to share how this book came about. What led you to write it? Let's start there.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out on Zoom tonight. It's really great to be here. I am a professor of rhetoric, and rhetoric is the study of the power of language to make and unmake worlds, to bring people together, to push them apart. And rhetoric has always been really closely associated with democracy since the time of the ancient Greeks. And so, in addition to being a scholar of rhetoric, I'm also a scholar of democracy. And I've been teaching classes on democracy, writing books about democracy, helping my students to develop the skills that they need to be competent, caring, compassionate citizens in the world for about 20 years now. And I've come to the conclusion that we, as a society, have gotten democracy all wrong. Um, we talk about democracy today as a war, as a battle, a battle between two political parties for elections, for money, for influence. So often we think about democracy as happening in Washington, D.C. only, or only happening during election days or election seasons. And this practice of democracy really dims the human spirit. And I think it also has a tendency to bring out the worst in us as human beings, as anger hardens into hatred. And we get so preoccupied with division that we lose track of all of the ways that we're connected. We lose track of the common ground that we stand on. And so I wrote this book really to inspire people to see democracy differently, to imagine a different way of practicing democracy, of coming together. And in the book, I define democracy as a communal practice of working together to care for ourselves, to care for each other, and to care for the life that we share. And so it's something that we do, it's something that we practice, it's something that we embody, it's something that happens every day in how we show up for each other. It's something that we do together as communities. And it's not about combat, it's about care. It's about caring for ourselves and each other and for everything that we share in this life. And like you said, we've got the anniversary of American independence coming up in about a week or so. We're honoring it with UFC fights and other things, it seems like. But one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to rewrite the Declaration of Independence as a declaration of interdependence. And I've had the chance to travel all over the country. I'll be in Washington, D.C. next week on July 1st at Busboys and Poets, leading a community reading of the Declaration of Interdependence, and then having a conversation about a different way of embodying democracy. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the backstory to the book.
You told me I think it's important here to add like you had a great story about like how you were on a retreat, I think, a couple of years ago and like wrote a poem and you sent it to Parallax Pressing. You've been a student of Thich Nhat Hanh for, years. And so can you just tell us a little bit more about like
Sure.
just I think your relationship with him and his teaching and then how there was just like it sounded like a wonderfully serendipitous story of you put something in and like a year later they wrote back and said, "How'd you like to make a book?"
Yeah. Yeah, this is the first trade book that I've written. So I've written academic books before, and you write an academic book, you spend 4 or 5 years researching and writing a book, and four people read it, or maybe six people read it. I don't know.
If you're lucky,
And
right?
It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to write a book that's in bookstores, that's actually reaching people, and so in 2018, I had the just amazing opportunity to travel to India and to Nepal to walk in the footsteps of the Buddha. And it's a pilgrimage with some of the monks from Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition. It's led by one of his senior lay students who lives in the Himalayas. And it was an amazing retreat. We had the chance to visit where the Buddha was born and where he died and where he was enlightened. We sat meditating under the Bodhi tree. We watched the sunset over Vulture Peak, chanting the Heart Sutra in Sanskrit and English. It was amazing. And since 2018, I've considered myself to be a student of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I've had the chance to visit Plum Village in France and to study with the monks and nuns here in the United States. And at the end of 2023, the same tour company that led this pilgrimage to India led a trip to Vietnam to visit where Thich Nhat Hanh was born, and also to visit the Root Temple where he studied to become a monk. And then the temple he returned to at the very end of his life after his exile was over. For 39 years, he was not allowed to return to Vietnam because of his peace work there. And it was a wonderful trip. I could talk about that trip for days. Walking through rice fields by bomb craters that have since filled with water and become lakes where lotus flowers are growing. Oh, I mean, just what a metaphor for rebirth and enlightenment and change. But one morning in Vietnam, we were outside of Hue in the middle of the country where Thich Nhat Hanh was born and where he passed. We had the opportunity to visit the place where he was cremated. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful setting in the mountains. And we sat in meditation, we sat in conversation, sharing reflections, just being present with each other. And there was this butterfly. It was black and blue and so beautiful, fluttering through our little group of pilgrims. And it would flutter through and disappear, and then it would come back and maybe land on someone's book or on a shoulder. And I just felt I felt the Buddha in that moment. I was like, that butterfly is the Buddha. I mean, it's our capacity for being present and for love. And I wrote a poem that morning on the bus ride after that experience, and I cheekily called it a lovely morning at the crematorium. And I submitted it to the international publication for Thich Nhat Hanh's press called the Mindfulness Bell. And I thought, yeah, I was there. It's a really nice poem. They'll publish it. I didn't hear back for a month. I didn't hear back for 2 months. I didn't hear back for 6 months. I didn't hear back for a year. And so I figured at that point, honestly, I forgot. And a year almost to the day after I submitted that poem, the editor, the poetry editor, emailed me and she said, "This is a beautiful poem. We're going to publish it tomorrow." And I was just overjoyed. And the next day, the editor at Parallax Press, which is the press Thich Nhat Hanh started, emailed me and she said, "I loved your poem. I see that you're a scholar of democracy. How would you feel about writing a book for us about mindfulness and democracy? And I said, I've been thinking about writing that book for years. So, what a wonderful opportunity to do that. So, we signed the contract, and she said, can you have us the book in 4 months? Which was, and I was just so happy. And an adjective that's often used to describe me is earnest. I was very earnest, and so I said, sure, I can do that. And I did. But that's a little bit again, yeah, like serendipity, right? Just one of those moments where the stars align, and it's so wonderful that this book was able to come out this year as we as a country are thinking, I hope, a little bit about, what we really truly value and how we want to move forward together.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that you told that story because it's such a great
Yeah.
story. And reminder, if you want to submit questions, to use the Q&A function on the bottom. Uh, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, the original Declaration of Independence, is 1,337 words long, which I didn't know before I read your book. I mean, I could have Googled it, I guess. But it's 1,337 words long, and it centers around 27 grievances against King George III. And I'm just actually remembering that, like, every year on NPR, they do like this group reading, right, of the Declaration of Independence. They have all their reporters. And so now I'm imagining like what would it be like for them to read yours, because yours is the heart of your book is that you rewrote the Declaration as a Declaration of Interdependence that is exactly the same number of words, 1,337 words, and also has 27 sections, but they're not grievances. You call them insights. And so we'll get more into that in a second about insights. But I just want to ask you, like, how was it, like, what was it like to take that form and then like repurpose it? You know, Landing on exactly 1,337 words. I imagine that was a piece of work. And yeah, so I'm curious to hear about that for sure.
It was a lot of fun, actually. I mean, as somebody who loves language, I actually wrote my dissertation about the Declaration of Independence, and a big part of my very first academic book was about the Declaration. So I know the text really well. I know the scholarship really well, and so I challenged myself. I said, "Okay, I'm going to rewrite this." But let's keep the same word count. Let's keep the same structure. There's 5 parts to the Declaration of Independence, so I kept that. And I kept some of the most well-known phrases, though I reimagine them to emphasize connection and community, which really isn't actually the main emphasis of the Declaration of Independence. And the biggest part of the Declaration, like you said, the original is the 27 grievances against the king. And it's really interesting, actually, this year to go through and read the original 27 grievances and see how many of those grievances actually could be applied to the situation we find ourselves in today.
Mhm.
And but I thought, the last thing the world needs right now is more grievances or more resentment. I mean,
We
just
save it
open
for
up.
we save it for Festivus, for the
Right,
airing of
exactly.
grievances. Yeah,
Yeah, the airing of grievances. I
that's
love it.
right.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do in my declaration was to offer 27 insights into the practice of mindful democracy and interdependence. And then the book ends up having 27 chapters. Each one of the chapters uh, explains the 27 insights that are in my Declaration of Interdependence. And another thing that people don't often know about the original declaration is that it was meant to be read aloud. It's a performative text. And There are these really interesting marks in the text. If you go to see an original, like an early copy at the Library of Congress, one of my favorite places in the world, there are these marks in the text. And people thought for a long time that they were just error marks from the printing press. But scholars have demonstrated now that actually they were meant to be pauses, like orator pauses. So
Mm,
you would pause for a moment to let the line land. And so I wrote my Declaration of Interdependence to be read aloud as well. So that was actually partly how I composed it was by going into a classroom and talking to an empty room.
mm.
So yeah,
I think I just also say like it's really striking reading the book. I mean, you mentioned before, all your other books have been academic books, and like this is not an academic book. This is an extremely accessible book. The sentences are short and accessible, right? The words are the vocabulary is accessible. There's nothing I found that like was intimidating, and so yeah, and I'm sure that was your intention. And just want to say, from my vantage point, I think you succeeded. You landed it. I
thank you.
want it. So you mentioned the 27 insights.
Yeah,
Uh, you grouped those, you clustered them into three groups.
yeah.
The first was stand on common ground, then walk the path of interdependence in community, and then practice democracy with hands and heart. So can you like walk us through on a high level? 27 is a lot to deal with, but three is a more manageable number. So maybe we can walk through like thematically what what you're getting at with each of those sections.
Sure. So the first part of the book is really about developing a particular kind of personal mindfulness practice. And so I'm a teacher of mindfulness. I've been teaching mindfulness for a long time. I'm also a scholar of mindfulness, and I know that a lot of you all are familiar actually with mindfulness practice through the Institute and all the good works that you all are doing. And when I teach people about mindfulness, I often use the example of a snow globe. Like the little thing you might buy in like a gift shop when you're on vacation or something like that. And you shake the snow globe up and there's all this stuff floating around. That's what our minds are like most of the time. Like we're just really, our heads are everywhere. We're really scrambled. And mindfulness practice is this beautiful practice of like setting the snow globe down on a table and allowing all of the stuff to settle. So mindfulness starts as a practice of slowing down, of calming down, of becoming more present, more focused, more alive to what's happening right now. Once you set that snow globe down, you can see things more clearly. And that's the moment at which insight becomes possible. It becomes possible to see our lives a little more clearly. And one of the things you notice when you look at yourself, at others, at the world, is just how deeply and profoundly interconnected we are. We truly are interdependent. Our country likes to idolize the ideal of the rugged individual, right? Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, is one I often teach. But no person is truly alone or truly self-reliant in the way that we often talk about in our culture. We have people we depend upon and people who depend upon us. We depend upon the rain and the green things of the earth. There would be no us without those things. And so the first part of the book is about developing a mindfulness practice to be more present to what's happening, but also to become more alive and awake to our deep and profound interdependence. Another thing that mindfulness really helps us with is, I call it developing inner freedom. And this is not an idea that is original to me. This is an idea that has many roots in many different traditions. And the idea is that in the space between action and reaction, between stimulus and response, there is an opportunity to pause, to slow down, to notice, and then to choose how we want to move forward. And that's a kind of freedom. And so that becomes really important to the book as well. The sense of freedom in the sense of being able to choose how we want to respond, to step out of habit, to step out of conditioning, to step out of the war and the battle that democracy has become. The second part of the book is then about building communities of support, communities where we can practice care, love, compassion together, and where we can unfold this sense, this deep sense of inner freedom, of mindfulness, of mindful awareness in the context of other people. Um, there's this great story I heard when we were at Plum Village. I went on a long retreat a couple years ago, and I don't remember which monk told this story, but he said there's this like idea that a lot of people who meditate have of running off to a cave or to the forest and just I'm just gonna practice by myself and I'm gonna become enlightened. So they told this story of a monk who goes to a cave and he meditates for 5 years. Um, doesn't see anybody else. I don't know how he doesn't see anybody else. I don't know where he gets his food. I don't know where he gets his water, whatever. But
We have a version of this story in the Talmud. I'll keep
oh,
going.
interesting.
I want
Cool.
to hear how
Yeah.
yours ends.
Yeah. I wonder if it ends the same way, actually.
We'll see.
Well, so the monk after 5 years says, "Yeah, I got it. I'm enlightened." And then his mother comes to visit. And after 3 days, the monk is yelling and realizes, okay, actually, I don't have it at all because what I had was something apart from other people, but we don't live apart from other people. We live with other people. We belong to other people. And so, if we're going to practice mindfulness and mindful democracy, we have to do it together. I don't know if that's how your story ends.
Uh, well, so I'll tell you how our version of that story, at
Yeah,
least the,
yeah.
the Talmudic or a
Uh-huh.
Talmudic version of that story is a story about this is an ancient story about two rabbis, a father and son, Shimon Bar Yochai, who's actually attributed as one of the founders of Jewish mysticism in a certain way,
Mm,
and his son, and they're being persecuted by the Romans. They flee and they run into a cave, right, and spend 7 years in the cave. And it says that all the time in that 7 years in the cave, they would spend their days uh, up to their necks in in the earth, and just studying Torah, like talking,
wow.
with each other. It's also, I mean, you also got echoes of Plato here, right, in terms of the cave and everything. And there's a carob tree to provide for food. There's a carob tree, and I think Mirak, I forget how water gets there, but anyway, they survive. And after 7 years, they come out, and everywhere they look, it's like there's heat vision, like Superman. It burns up the earth because they become so judgmental. Like that, right? It did not, and God actually says to them, "Go back in the cave. You got to get it right."
Yeah.
And so they have to do it again, and they come out, and ultimately they learn to be much more compassionate and virtuous. But exactly what you're saying, that in the absence of community, right, mindfulness practice or any practice can lead to a kind of judgmentalism and, fierceness that in your story comes out with the guy's mother. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the challenges with the way that mindfulness is often taught today. We often experience it through an app with our earbuds in, and a practice that really should open us to each other and to the world almost gets reinscribed as a way of closing us off even further. And so I think practicing mindfulness together is so important. So the second part of the book is really about building beloved community. And then the third part of the book is about action. Like, what are some of the things that we can do in order to create a more caring, loving, less painful, more just world? So, the third part of the book really is about if mindful democracy is a communal practice of working together to care for ourselves, to care for each other, and to care for the life we share, how do we do that? And I offer some real practical suggestions for things that we can do, recognizing that what feels right to a particular community will always be determined by that community. Um, so that's kind of the overview of the arc of the book.
Yeah. I also want to encourage folks, I said, it's a very accessible book. It's also like you can certainly take your time and read it, and you should. And it's not going to take you long to read. Like if you wanted to just read it cover to cover, you could do that in, a couple of hours. And so, yeah, like highly encourage here. There's nothing intimidating about this good book, even though, and it has a tremendous amount of wisdom. So one of the, to me, one of the most like I thought original and valuable parts of the book where you have a few chapters on deliberation. Um, and there was a note I have here that on page 124, you point out, you say, anytime humans gather, anytime humans gather, disagreement is bound to happen. In our community, we call that two Jews, three opinions, right? But anytime humans gather, disagreement is bound to happen. And then you remind us that disagreement therefore is not a sign of being disagreement isn't a sign of not being mindful. It's not a sign of being disrespectful. It's just kind of this natural thing that happens when you get people together. I was reminded when I was reading that of I'm a student of Gil Fronsdal as one of my teachers. And Gil, I've heard define community as the people who, if conflict is inevitable, then I want to be in conflict with those people. That's my community, right? So, and at the same time, so like conflict is inevitable, disagreement is inevitable, et cetera, right? But you also point out that that while we live in a culture that seems to love fighting, you point out that most people are actually terrified of disagreement. I feel like I hear this from my kids, when they say, my teacher yelled at me. Your teacher actually didn't yell at you. They just like actually gave you some constructive feedback or whatever, right? So people are terrified of disagreement, many people. And social media has really played a big role in that. You write about that, about because of the anonymity it provides, and so I think all of this is such an important part of the book, and because I think it really takes mindfulness practice from being just a way of regulating our inner lives, which is the way a lot of us use it, I will say, certainly speaking personally. It takes it into the interpersonal and the political realm as well in terms of mindful speech and mindful listening. So I want to invite you to say more about mindfulness practice and disagreement and persuasion, because I think also for this audience as well, like that is there's so much there's so much Jews have to say about that, in the culture of Torah study, the culture of the Beit Midrash. So anyway, I would love to invite you to talk more about persuasion and deliberation.
Sure. One thing that I've noticed, I teach a big lecture class on propaganda. I teach smaller classes on deliberation and controversy, public controversy. And I've noticed that my students are so much better able to hold space, to make arguments, to listen to what other people have to say if they've been practicing mindfulness. So that inner work that we do, and mindfulness is partly inner work for sure, really helps with deliberation. But deliberation itself can become a kind of mindfulness practice as well, which I think is interesting. And it's not an area where a lot of mindfulness scholars or teachers go. And so thinking about disagreement, there's lots of ways we could manage disagreement, right? Our culture, I think, models so many bad ways to manage disagreement. And it's so easy to disagree to the point of violence online when you don't actually have to interact with another human being.
Hmm.
But in spaces where you're actually with other people, I think deliberation is one of the greatest inventions of humanity. It's one of the best ways that we have developed for managing disagreement. So I imagine deliberation as a way of managing disagreement. And disagreement is not bad. Disagreement is how we learn, right? I mean, that's the only way that we learn. If everyone believes exactly the same thing, and we don't have anything to argue about, how are we ever going to learn? So, thinking about mindfulness and deliberation, I point out the difference between a debate and a deliberation. In a debate, the point is to win, it's for your side to win. But when we deliberate, it's not about one side winning or the other side losing. Instead, it's about us as a community making the best decision that we possibly can under the present circumstances with the information we have. And that shift I've found with my students is profound when they
Hmm.
go from thinking of deliberation as a performance, like a lot of them do sometimes, like it's something that um, I'm doing in order to seem really smart, or I'm doing in order to get clicks on social media by saying something really outrageous. I ask my students to set that aside. Um, and instead to think about, okay, we have a topic that's important to all of us. We need to come to a decision. How can we come to the best decision that we possibly can? How can we utilize all of the wisdom in the room? And from that, there are so many little lessons that I talk about in the book. One of the most profound, I think, often is not thinking of changing your mind as necessarily a bad thing, but also not taking it personally every time someone disagrees with you. Um, I found my students are so reluctant to speak up because they don't want to seem wrong. They think if they say something and people disagree with it, it means that they're not smart. But that's not the case at all. So, how do we get to a place in a community where we hold each other and support each other in such a way that we really can deliberate? Is one of the questions that I think about a lot in the book.
Yeah. I actually want to bring in, there's a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A that are, I think, related to this. And so would love to bring them in. So I'll share both of them and then we can respond to them. So Karen asked the question, in seeking to build community, we encounter people around us who are existing within an echo chamber or epistemic bubble. As a professor of rhetoric, can you talk about how we approach gently piercing those containers to invite people into relationships? That's, I think, related to what you're talking about right now.
Good
And then
question.
there's another question. Can you talk about the relationship between what you're saying about deliberation and an adjacent Buddhist concept, nonviolent communication? So maybe just sharing both of those. So one is like echo chambers, epistemic bubbles, and the other is nonviolent communication.
I found that, I mean, the question of, echo chambers, epistemic bubbles is such, I mean, it's such a pressing issue for us. I found, at least with my students, that going directly at them in a situation like that and trying to point out the ways that they're wrong or the ways that they've erred or the stupidity of their view. I mean, that I wouldn't say that, but sometimes other students say that to other students. That is the opposite of an approach that I think works because it often actually causes people to just double down on
Mhm.
where they are. So instead, in those circumstances, I think providing a different picture, a different model of the way things could work, of what could be believed in, um, and just allowing it to be there alongside that epistemic bubble, um, often is the best way to, I don't know, get people to start thinking and questioning what it is that they believe. So if you can create community spaces where people do feel comfortable speaking up, even if they want to be quiet, I think that really is the way that change happens. Like so many people who study persuasion have shown that rarely do arguments actually change minds. What changed minds is changing contexts. So if we can change the context in which people are existing, or at least provide them an alternative to that, that really can be a way of broadening minds.
Mhm.
And I've seen it work. So yeah, but that is a problem. I mean, Josh, what do you think about that? I mean, I'm sure you
About
understand.
echo chambers and
Yeah.
at this point there are so many barriers, right? It takes very conscious action, I think, um, to seek out uh, heterogeneous spaces, both online and in person. Like we've been so sorted into zip codes and, um, gerrymandered in every way, basically. Um, and uh, and so, even more so than it's like looking for those opportunities. And there is actually, since, I mean, I used to be in this business. I'm not so centrally in the business anymore, but since, the mid 2010s, there's been a growing movement of efforts to get into like purple areas, as it were, right? And to find opportunities for people of different political backgrounds, and oftentimes that correlates with socioeconomics and religion and education, to be able to talk in structured ways. There's a wonderful organization with very Jewish roots called Resetting the Table, that my friend and colleague Rabbi Melissa Weintraub founded, that does a lot of this kind of work. But there's, the Bridge Alliance is like one umbrella organization that, has lots of member orgs that are doing stuff. And so, um, uh, yeah, I think that there is like we have to actively put ourselves into those spaces. And that's where our practice can really help because, as you said, like if you're grounded in it, then it's a lot easier. You're going to have a much higher chance of success of actually um, being staying in the conversation and not being triggered and not responding in a triggered way. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
there's I was gonna say there's an old rhetorical practice called in ultram que partum, that's from Latin, like literally seeing or arguing both sides.
right.
And that's an exercise I do with my students, but I do it in a slightly different way of I'll have them argue, what do they feel about a particular position? And then someone who is opposed to them make an argument for their position as well. But then as a class, I'll say, okay, what's a third, a fourth, and a fifth position? And let's argue those collectively as a class.
Mhm.
And so decentering just two positions, because so rarely in life is it A or B. It's usually A or B or C or D or E or F. But we're so locked into seeing things as A versus B that we don't see those other alternatives. And that's another thing that deliberation can really help us to do, especially mindful deliberation, is to recognize that actually there are a number of other positions or options or possibilities in any moment that we can wake up to. Um,
I did want to mention that, like,
yeah.
another Talmudic story that
Oh,
comes to
good.
somebody
Yeah.
asked somebody asked in the chat, is his book Jewish? And no, your book is you're a Buddhist, and like this is written from that tradition and an American tradition
Yeah.
also. And as I'm trying to make clear here, and but I think there's so many adjacencies and ways of putting
Yeah.
this into Jewish language. I also and so I'll mention one story in a second. I also want to give a plug, and Tamar, we should put this in the email that goes out after this event. Is that on my podcast for the last several episodes, we've actually been doing between Memorial Day and July 4th. I've actually been devoting each episode to a piece related to your book. So if you want the Jewish version, if you want the Jewish translation, some of that work is on the podcast on Soulful Jewish Living. But the story that came to mind is a pretty important story in the Talmud about um, there's this enormous culture of disagreement, of course, in the Talmud. Like that is what the Talmud is. It's a record of disagreement, and among other things. And so one of the stories is that for 3 years, the House of Shammai and the House of Hillel, the two sort of big political parties, we could say, of their day, but in the study hall, they argued about what the law should be, and it was undecided for 3 years until finally, at the end of 3 years, a voice from heaven comes out and it says, "Both of these are the words of the living God." Elu
Hmm.
Elu Divrei Elohim Chaim. They're both the words of the living God, and the law is going to follow the house of Hillel. Why? Because they were pleasant in how they spoke, among other
Hmm.
things. They were pleasant in how they spoke, and to your point, they stated the arguments of their opponents first. Right? So as a rhetorical,
Yeah.
not just rhetorical, but substantively, it's like we're acknowledging your position, and that actually then becomes the basis upon which we should all try to model ourselves and how we conduct ourselves, right? So it's a yeah. There's all sorts of cognates here. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time left, and an important question that I want to get to, and then we'll wrap up. And I'm going to ask you to read a part. But towards the end of the 27 insights that you have. I think you deal with a pretty crucial question, which is the limits of tolerance in a democracy. And I have a feeling this chapter might have been like a little different to write. I don't know, maybe if it felt that way or not. But because this is a tough one, right? The limits of tolerance in a democracy. Specifically, how far do we extend ourselves in trying to include those who insist on being hateful? I think is your language. You write that this is you, the hateful person who continues to behave cruelly and uses their words as weapons, even after others have repeatedly pointed out the hurt these choices cause, represents a danger to the beloved community and everyone who participates in it. So I think this is obviously like a major ethical question. I can imagine folks in our audience have been thinking about it a lot. And so I'd love to invite you to elaborate on this part. How should we think about the limits of our tolerance?
Oh, what a challenging question, isn't it? And such a human question. I think about this context in the context of, being a professor who teaches classes on ethics. I think about this in the context of everything that's going on in our country right now. I think of this in the context of hateful speakers who've been invited to my campus and given a platform to speak in the name of fair and balanced communication. And so I was thinking about all of that writing this chapter. And Thich Nhat Hanh, one of his mantras in our community is, there is no way to peace, peace is the way. And it's a phrase actually that comes from A.J. Muste and the American nonviolent traditions of nonviolence. And the idea is that you can't fight a war for peace because fighting the war undermines the goal of peace. You can't get to peace through war. You can only get to peace through peace. And in my book, I say there is no way to democracy. Democracy is the way. You can't have a state of exception where you say democracy just doesn't apply today. We're going to be hateful and violent towards each other. No, I mean, democracy is how we show up for each other. Um, and part of democracy really is about creating spaces, creating community spaces where people feel safe, safe enough to disagree, safe enough to deliberate, safe enough to give the gift of self. And actually, the words community and communication in Latin, munus is part of that word, gift. And calm is part of those words, with, together. It's a gift of giving together, it's a gift of self.
Mm,
I think of the story I often tell my students. Let's say that you're having a party, not a rager, not like but just like a party, people getting together, they're supporting each other, they're laughing, they have a good time, and somebody you invited insists on going around the room punching everyone. Is that okay? And my students all say, no, 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 that's not okay. You can't do that. And I say, well, but isn't that often what we do? It's just the punches are verbal, in our spaces. So
mhm,
what do we do with the person who insists on running around the room, punching people verbally, punching with hatred? I think that in those moments, we have to be mindful. I think we have to be deliberate. I think we have to be compassionate, um, but we also often have to be firm um, in, you know, recognizing that actually we've reached a limit of our tolerance. One of the things I've noticed, though, is that sometimes those moments where we realize we've come to a limit, that hate actually has no place in democracy. And that's one of my chapters. That's one of the insights. Hatred has no place in democracy. It's often easy to hate the people who hate. It's often easy to turn these situations where someone needs to be excluded into situations of war and battle and enemyship. And so I think those are moments where we especially have to be mindful and careful with how we proceed, remembering that there is no way to democracy. Democracy is the way. So, can we uphold our commitment to care for ourselves, to care for other people, to care for the life we share, even in those moments of exclusion.
mm.
Uh, yeah,
So let me invite you to close us out here, just with reading at the end of the book. I think from page 154. You write really beautifully, and there are these moments when you turn directly to the reader. And so if on 154, you have from if you hear the voices of desperation, which I think a lot of people are hearing voices of desperation right now. So I took it as a very nice form of encouragement. So maybe you want to read that for us and take us home with that.
sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
If you hear the voices of desperation, depression, and nihilism arising in your mind, remember to tap into the deep well springs of hope. For hope is a practice. It is like gratitude and love, something that we nourish. This hope is not groundless. It is rooted in the change we experience in our own practice and in the connections we forge when we build community to practice, deliberate, and act together. The conditions for hope are already here. Slow down, look deeply, and you will see them. I leave you with a poem I wrote during the darkest days of winter in the Allegheny Mountains of central Pennsylvania, when the sun did not show itself for 2 weeks and an icy drizzle made it dangerous to be outside. At precisely the moment my spirits needed a lift, I looked out the window into our backyard and saw a drop of water fall to the ground from a branch of one of the many Japanese maple trees I planted that one day might become bonsai. At that moment, I stopped dreaming of spring and felt the warmth that was already here. The warmth of mindful, loving presence. The warmth that comes from awakening to interdependence. And then I wrote a little poem. Hope. Snow melts from a tree branch. Someday soon it will be a cloud, and rain will fall on new leaves. There is spring and winter and spring. Take heart. Having together declared our interdependence and having pledged to care for each other and for the life that we share, this is where we part now, dear friends. I leave you in the fortuitous space between now and next, between today and tomorrow, between a present so real you can reach out and touch it, and a future that is never guaranteed but that responds to loving, mindful action. The space of freedom, the space of responsibility, the space of choice, the space of community, the space of mindfulness, which, when life is rightly viewed as a shared project that begins from common ground, is also the space of democracy.
Jeremy, thank you so much. It's a beautiful place to close. Thank you for writing this book. I really want to encourage everybody to get a copy, get your friends together next weekend and have a reading together. There's also just a lot of really great uh, ideas for things to do that you include in this book. So really can't recommend it highly enough. And I just want to thank you for your time for being here tonight. So thank you, and thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm going to give it back to Tamar to close us out.